"She is too old, Your Grace," Lady Beatrice Finch murmured, her voice a conspiratorial whisper that slid through the ballroom's gilded air like a serpent through fallen leaves. At 28, a woman is firmly on the shelf, and so terribly plain. No dowry to speak of course. A poor relation must know her place. Alistair Beaumont, the Duke of Blackwood, watched the subject of his aunt's dissection across the room, Miss Eleanor Ainsworth. He saw her not as a collection of deficiencies, but as an island of quiet in a sea of screeching peacocks. While other women glittered and chattered, their laughter like shattering glass, Eleanor stood near the ferns, a book of poetry held loosely in one hand, her gaze distant. She was not plain, he thought. Not in the way a daisy is plain compared to a hothouse orchid. Her features were serene, her eyes a thoughtful gray that seemed to absorb the light and hold it. He felt a familiar weariness settle over him, as heavy and cloying as the scent of wilting gardenias that permeated the room. For 5 years since his wife's death, his life had been a hollow thing, a succession of duties managed by others. Lady Beatrice, his late wife's cousin, had swept in to oversee his household and his twin daughters, her presence a constant, suffocating comfort he had been too numb to refuse. Now, her voice was the soundtrack to his gilded prison. "Lord Ashworth's daughter has a fortune of £50,000, Beatrice continued, her fan fluttering with avaricious energy. "And she is just 17, the bloom of youth, perfect for the girls." Alistair's gaze drifted to his daughters, Elspeth and Isolde, who were meant to be in the nursery. Instead, they had materialized at Eleanor's side. Isolde, the bolder of the two, was whispering something in her ear, her small hand clutching Eleanor's dark green silk skirt. Eleanor bent down, her expression softening into a genuine warmth that Alistair had not seen on any other face in this house for years. She listened. It was a simple act, yet in this place it felt profound. The girls seemed to like Eleanor, Alistair noted, his voice flat. He took a sip of his champagne. It tasted of dust and obligation. Beatrice's lips thinned into a bloodless line. "Children are taken with novelty. Miss Ainsworth is a novelty, one that will wear off. You need a duchess, Alistair, a proper one, not a charity case who fills your daughters' heads with poetry and nonsense." The words, meant to be poison, landed with a dull thud. He was too tired for them to sting. He was a prize bull, and Beatrice was his tireless manager, parading suitable heifers before him. The thought was crude, and the wry, internal humor it sparked was the only truly genuine feeling he'd had all evening. He watched Eleanor again. She caught his eye across the crowded room, and a flicker of something, surprise, perhaps apprehension, crossed her face before she looked away. He saw the slight flush on her cheeks, the way her fingers tightened on her book. He was the Duke, she was the poor relation. The distance between them was a chasm carved by title and fortune, a chasm his aunt policed with vicious diligence. Later that night, the oppressive weight of the party had given way to the suffocating silence of the great house. Alistair sat in his study, the fire reduced to glowing embers, a glass of brandy untouched at his elbow. He could hear the house settling, the groan of old timbers like a sigh of exhaustion. His life was a perfectly arranged, beautifully decorated mausoleum. A knock, soft and deferential, came at the door. It was Eleanor. She held a small tray with a cup of chamomile tea. "I saw your light was still on, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet. "I thought this might help you rest." She did not look at him directly, her focus on placing the tray on the small table beside his chair. The scent of chamomile, clean and calming, cut through the stale air of the room. It was a small, thoughtful gesture, an act of kindness with no agenda he could discern. "Thank you, Miss Ainsworth," he said, the formality feeling absurd in the quiet intimacy of the late hour. She curtsied, a slight, graceful movement. "The girls were asking for you. Isolde wanted to show you a beetle she found." A pang of guilt, sharp and unwelcome, pierced his apathy. He had not seen his daughters before they were put to bed. He had been too busy being a duke. "I was occupied. Lady Beatrice insists these events are essential." "Of course, Your Grace." Her expression was unreadable, but for a moment he thought he saw a shadow of the same weariness he felt reflected in her gray eyes. She saw the cage too, she just lived in a much smaller, more precarious corner of it. "Does your aunt treat you well, Miss Ainsworth?" The question surprised him as much as it did her. It was a departure from the script, a deviation from the silent agreement of their respective roles. Her head came up, and her eyes met his. For the first time that night, he saw past the quiet governess and glimpsed the woman within. There was a flicker of defiance, a spark of pride, quickly extinguished. "Lady Beatrice is very good to me. She has given me a home." The words were correct, the sentiment hollow. They both knew it. A home is not always a haven, he said, more to himself than to her. She gave a small, sad smile that transformed her supposedly plain face into something achingly beautiful. No, Your Grace, it is not. She curtsied again and slipped from the room, leaving him with the scent of chamomile and a profound, unsettling sense of his own failure. He had the power to change everything in this house with a single word, yet he allowed his aunt's petty cruelties to flourish like weeds in the garden of his grief. He looked at the untouched brandy, then picked up the teacup. It was still warm. For the first time in a long time, Alistair felt a flicker of something other than loss. It felt like shame. The next few weeks passed in a blur of stifling routine. Alistair found himself watching Eleanor, not with the detached assessment of a potential bride, but with a growing, unwelcome curiosity. He saw how she managed the household accounts with a sharp, efficient mind that belied her dreamy, poetic reputation. He saw how she soothed Elspeth's nightmares when the nursemaids failed. He saw how she carved out small moments of joy for the twins, creating a world of fairy tales and pressed flowers within the cold stone walls of Blackwood House. He also saw the 1,000 tiny cuts Beatrice inflicted upon her daily. A snide remark about her dress, a public correction of a minor error, the constant grinding insinuation that Eleanor was a burden, a charity case, one step away from destitution. And Eleanor absorbed it all with a quiet dignity that Alistair was beginning to realize was not passivity but a form of immense, exhausting strength. One afternoon, he came across her in the library, sunlight from the tall windows illuminating the dust motes dancing around her. She was not reading but staring out at the rain-swept garden, her face a mask of profound melancholy. The sight of her solitary sadness moved him in a way the most dramatic public displays of emotion never could. He did not announce himself, simply stood in the doorway watching. He was the master of this house, the lord of all he surveyed, yet he felt like an intruder in her private moment of grief. What sorrows did a poor relation have? He had never thought to ask. He had assumed her world was small, her concerns trivial. He was beginning to understand how wrong he was. The world of Eleanor Ainsworth was not small. It was a vast, internal landscape of resilience and quiet suffering, a world he had been too blind and too self-absorbed to even notice existed right under his own roof. The thought was humbling, and for a man like him, humility was a foreign, deeply uncomfortable country. He retreated from the doorway, his footsteps silent, his heart heavy with a feeling he could not yet name. It was not pity, it was something closer to respect, and that, he realized, was far more dangerous. The end came with a sickening swiftness, like a trap sprung on an unsuspecting animal. It was a Tuesday, a day of no particular importance, which made the manufactured drama all the more grotesque. Alistair was in his study, attempting to make sense of a report on his Scottish estates, when Beatrice burst in without knocking, her face a theatrical mask of horror and outrage. "Alistair, you must come at once. It is a disaster, a humiliation. I cannot believe the viper we have harbored in our bosom." Her voice was a shrill instrument of chaos. He rose slowly, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. "Beatrice, what is it?" "It is Eleanor," she cried, pressing a hand to her chest. "The shame of it. I went to her room to discuss the menus and I found this." She thrust her hand forward. Lying in her palm was a man's cufflink, a gaudy thing of gold and onyx that Alistair had never seen before. And this, tucked beneath her mattress, the brazen hussy. She produced a creased sheet of paper, a letter. Alistair took it, his hands feeling strangely numb. The script was a florid, overly ornate scrawl, the words a crude parody of a lover's missive. It spoke of secret meetings, of stolen kisses, of a plan to use her position to secure a future together once she had bled the old Duke dry. It was signed only with an initial. L. The words were poison, designed to strike at his deepest insecurities. The fear of being used for his title, his fortune. The fear of being made a fool of. For 5 years, Beatrice had been whispering this narrative into his ear, and now, here was the proof. His grief had made him careless, his apathy a fertile ground for her seeds of suspicion. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice a low growl. The blood was pounding in his ears, a hot, furious tide of betrayal. "In the morning room," Beatrice said, her eyes glittering with triumph. "With the girls? The audacity!" He strode from the room, the letter clenched in his fist. He did not question the evidence. He did not pause to consider the source. The carefully constructed edifice of his doubt in Beatrice crumbled, replaced by the raw, wounded pride of a man who believed he had been played for a fool. He found her just as Beatrice had said. She was seated on the floor with Elspeth and Isolde, a book of illustrated birds open before them. The scene was one of peaceful, domestic innocence. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the three of them in a golden haze. It was a portrait of the life he was beginning to think he might want, and the letter in his hand told him it was all a lie. "Miss Ainsworth," he said. His voice was cold, sharp, a shard of ice in the warm room. She looked up, her smile fading as she saw his face. The girls looked up too, their expressions turning from delight to confusion. Eleanor rose slowly to her feet, her hands automatically smoothing her skirt. "Your Grace?" He did not speak. He simply held out the letter. She took it, her brow furrowed in confusion. He watched her face as she read. He saw her confusion morph into disbelief, then into a pale, bloodless horror. Her hand flew to her mouth, the letter trembling like a captured moth. I don't understand," she whispered, her grey eyes wide with shock. "I have never seen this before. It is not true." "Is this not also yours?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. He held up the cufflink. She stared at it, utterly bewildered. "No, I have never seen it. Your Grace, I swear to you." "Swear nothing." He cut her off, the rage coiling in his gut making him cruel. "You have been playing a very long, very patient game, Miss Ainsworth. My aunt was right about you from the beginning, a grasping, duplicitous—" He could not bring himself to say the word in front of his daughters, who were now huddled together, watching with wide, frightened eyes. He saw the last vestiges of color drain from her face. He saw the light in her eyes extinguish, replaced by a dull, profound hurt that was almost worse than tears. She did not argue. She did not protest. She simply absorbed the blow, her body held rigid with shock. He had expected a fight, a denial, a storm of weeping. He got silence, a terrible, damning silence that his rage interpreted as guilt. "I want you out of this house," he said, the words falling like stones into the quiet room. "Pack your things. A carriage will take you to the station. I never want to see your face again." Eleanor did not move. She seemed frozen, a statue carved from ice and despair. It was Isolde who broke the spell. She ran forward and grabbed Eleanor's skirt, her small face a furious, tear-stained mask. "No," she cried. "Papa, no! Eleanor didn't do it. She would never. Aunt Beatrice is a liar." "Isolde, go to your room," Alistair commanded, his voice harsh. "No!" the child sobbed, clinging tighter. "Don't send her away, please." Eleanor finally moved. She looked down at the weeping child, her own face a blank mask of pain. She gently detached Isolde's fingers from her skirt. "Do as your father says, my dear," she said, her voice a reedy, unfamiliar thing. She knelt and looked at the twins, her composure cracking for just a moment. "Be good for each other." She rose and looked at Alistair one last time. There was no anger in her gaze, no defiance. There was only a vast empty space where respect and affection had once been. It was a look of utter annihilation. She had seen him, truly seen him, and he had failed the test in the most spectacular way imaginable. "As you wish, Your Grace," she said, her voice devoid of all emotion. Then she turned and walked from the room, her back perfectly straight, her head held high. He watched her go, the letter burning a hole in his hand, his daughter's sobs echoing in the sudden, terrible emptiness of the sunlit room. He had won. He had rooted out the viper from his home. He had never felt less like a victor in his life. He felt like a butcher. Eleanor did not weep. The capacity for tears seemed to have been burned out of her, cauterized by the cold fire of Alistair's accusation. She moved through her room in a state of numb, methodical calm. This was not a flight of passion. It was a strategic evacuation from a disaster zone. She did not pack her fine dresses, the silks and muslins that were the uniform of her gilded cage. They belonged to that life, to the woman the Duke thought she was. She left them hanging in the wardrobe, ghosts of a future that had just been murdered. Instead, she took her plainest, most durable traveling dress of grey wool. She packed a single change of linen, her mending kit, and the small worn volume of poetry Alistair had seen her with. Her gaze fell upon the jewelry box on her dresser, a gift from Beatrice years ago. It contained a few modest trinkets, baubles meant to signify her dependent status. She opened it, her fingers bypassing the brooches and pearl buttons. At the bottom, nestled in velvet, was a simple silver locket, tarnished with age. It had been her mother's. It was the only thing of true value she possessed. She picked it up, the cool metal of familiar comfort in her palm. Then, with a deliberation that surprised her, she placed it back on the dresser, outside the box, where it would be seen. It was a final, silent statement. The Eleanor he thought he knew, the one who might be bought or sold, was a fiction. This locket was part of her soul, and she would not take a piece of her soul from a house that had just tried to steal it. There was the matter of money. She was, as her aunt so often reminded her, poor, but she was not a fool. As the unofficial manager of the household's daily expenses, she was in charge of the housekeeping funds. A small tin box in her desk drawer contained £20, a significant sum meant to last the month. Taking it was theft. But staying was a slow suicide of the spirit. Her own small savings amounted to less than £2. It was not enough. She looked at the tin box. This was not the Duke's personal fortune. This was the money for bread, for coal, for the wages of the downstairs maids. It was practical money, working money, and she was a woman who now had to work to survive. She took the £20, her heart pounding a dull, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She left the meticulously kept ledger on the desk, open to the current page, the balance recorded in her neat, precise hand. Let them call it theft, she would call it severance. She put on her bonnet and tied the ribbons with steady hands. She pulled on her gloves. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, a stranger in grey wool, her face pale and composed. The woman who had wept over sad poems and dreamed of a kind word from a lonely duke was gone. In her place was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more pragmatic. She walked down the grand staircase, her footsteps making no sound on the thick carpet. She did not look at the portraits of Alistair's ancestors staring down at her with their painted, aristocratic disdain. She was already a ghost in this house. The butler, a man who had served the family for 40 years, saw her at the door, her small valise in hand. He did not meet her eye. He simply opened the heavy oak door and let the damp London air sweep in. He knew. Everyone would know. The servants' network was faster and more efficient than the telegraph. The carriage Alistair had ordered was waiting. A plain, unmarked brougham for the sake of discretion. His cruelty, it seemed, was tempered by a desire to avoid a public scene. She gave the driver the name of the main railway station and got in without a backward glance. As the carriage pulled away from Blackwood House, she did not look back. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on a future that was a terrifying, unknown blank. The numbness was beginning to recede, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. She was alone. She was disgraced. She had £22 to her name. And for the first time in her life, she was free. The thought was so overwhelming, so laced with panic and a wild, hysterical spark of hope, that she finally pressed her face into her gloved hands and allowed a single dry sob to escape. A year passed. A year that felt like a lifetime. In the small, windswept coastal town of Saltwind, a woman known as Anna Gable mended fishing nets by the harbour. Her fingers, once accustomed to fine embroidery, now calloused and stained with tar. She kept the books for the baker and the chandler, her neat ledgers a small anchor of order in a life governed by the chaotic whims of the sea. She lived in a small, clean room above the inn, owned by the real Mrs. Gable, a shrewd, kind widow who had asked no questions and offered a job in exchange for rent. The sea air had weathered her skin, and the hard work had thinned her frame, but it had also straightened her spine. The Eleanor Ainsworth who had wilted under her aunt's scorn was gone. Anna Gable looked the world straight in the eye. Her quietness was no longer the result of suppression, but of observation. She listened to the fishermen's tales, to the merchants' worries, to the rhythm of the tides. She had traded a gilded cage for a life of relentless toil, and in doing so had found not happiness, but a solid, unshakable sense of self. She was no longer a reflection of other people's expectations. She was simply Anna, and Anna was a survivor. In London, nearly 300 miles away, the Duke of Blackwood was also living in the aftermath. The year had been a long, silent, echoing hell. The vivacious debutante his aunt had pushed him toward had lasted 2 excruciating months in his life before her vapid chatter and endless demands had driven him to a state of near madness. He had ended the engagement, incurring the wrath of her family and the gleeful gossip of the ton. Beatrice remained, her presence now a toxic miasma that clung to every room. Her triumph over Eleanor had emboldened her. Her suggestions had become commands. Her management of the household had become a tyrannical reign of waste and extravagance. The house, once merely silent, now felt dead. The servants moved with a fearful resentment. The flowers in the vases were always lilies, their scent thick and funereal. But the true measure of his desolation was his daughters. They had retreated from him. Elspeth had grown silent and watchful, her grey eyes, so like Eleanor's, filled with a quiet reproach he could not bear to meet. Isolde's grief was louder, a constant simmering rage. She had taken to calling her great-aunt Aunt Beastly to her face, a transgression that earned her punishments, which only hardened her defiance. The breaking point came on a rainy afternoon in the nursery. Alistair found Isolde sitting on the floor, smashing a porcelain doll against the leg of a table. "Isolde," he said, his voice sharper than he intended, "what is the meaning of this?" She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears and fury. "This is Lady Ashworth's daughter," she shrieked, holding up the decapitated doll. "She is stupid, and I hate her. I hate everyone. I want Eleanor back." "Eleanor is not coming back," he said, his voice weary. "It's your fault," she screamed, throwing the doll's head at him. It missed, shattering against the wall. "And it's Aunt Beastly's fault. She lies. She lies about everything. She lied about Eleanor." "That is enough, Isolde," he said, his authority sounding hollow even to his own ears. "No," she insisted, her small body trembling with rage. "I heard her. The night Eleanor left. I was hiding. I heard her talking to her maid. She was laughing. She said, 'The little fool fell for it completely. The cufflink was a masterstroke.' She said you were easy to lead by the nose like a prize bull. She said Eleanor was gone for good and now the house was hers." The child's words struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. He felt the blood drain from his face. A prize bull, led by the nose. It was a truth so ugly, so brutally accurate, that it stole the air from his lungs. He had been a fool, a blind, arrogant, grieving fool. And his daughter, in her childish rage, had just handed him the terrible, unvarnished truth. He looked at the shattered doll, at his weeping, furious child, and at the ghost of Eleanor that haunted every corner of this miserable house. The apathy that had encased him for 5 years cracked, and through the fissure poured a white-hot, cleansing rage. It was not directed at his daughter or even at Beatrice. It was directed entirely at himself. That evening, he did not descend for dinner. He went to Eleanor's old room. It had been kept locked on Beatrice's orders. He used his master key to open it. The air inside was stale, but it was clean. The maids, it seemed, had defied Beatrice's orders to let it fall to dust. Everything was as she had left it. The dresses in the wardrobe, the books on the shelf, and on the dresser, gleaming dully in the moonlight from the window, sat a small silver locket. He picked it up. It was warm, as if it had been holding the last bit of her presence in the room. He opened it. Inside were 2 miniature portraits, crudely painted but filled with love. A man and a woman smiling, her parents. He had thrown her out with nothing, and she had left behind the only thing that mattered to her. The locket felt like a lead weight in his hand, a symbol of his monumental, catastrophic failure as a man. The next morning, he sent a message to Mr. Reed, his solicitor. The message was brief. "Begin a discreet but thorough investigation into the financial and personal affairs of Lady Beatrice Finch, effective immediately. Spare no expense. I also require you to locate the man who owns a gold and onyx cufflink, and find Miss Eleanor Ainsworth. Find her." The investigation was a slow, meticulous process of unraveling a web of lies that Beatrice had been weaving for years. Mr. Reed, a man as dry and precise as the legal documents he drafted, was brutally efficient. He discovered that Beatrice was deeply in debt to a dozen different dressmakers and jewelers. He uncovered bank drafts showing large, regular payments to a disgraced former army captain named Llewellyn, a man known for his expensive tastes and flexible morals. A man whose signature cufflink was gold and onyx. The love letter was a forgery, its florid prose purchased for £5. The theft of the housekeeping money was a lie. Eleanor's ledgers were perfect. It was Beatrice who had been skimming from the household accounts for years, a fact she had cleverly concealed by firing any underling who grew too curious. Every discovery was a fresh twist of the knife in Alistair's gut. He had not just been wrong, he had been a willing accomplice in his own deception. He had handed Beatrice the power to destroy an innocent woman, and she had wielded it with surgical precision. The shame was a physical thing, a constant acidic churning in his stomach. Finding Eleanor was harder. She had vanished. She had paid cash for a train ticket north and then disappeared as if the earth had swallowed her. For months, Reed's agents came up empty. Alistair grew desperate. The silence in his house was no longer just empty, it was accusatory. His daughter's sad eyes followed him everywhere. It was a chance remark from one of the investigators that finally broke the case. He had been tracking the circulation of the £20 Eleanor had taken, a near impossible task. But one of the banknotes, part of a new series, had been traced from the Bank of England to a regional bank in a small coastal town. Saltwind. It was a long shot, a needle in a vast haystack. Alistair did not hesitate. He told a furious Beatrice he was going to Scotland to inspect his estates. He packed a bag, collected his daughters, and took the train west, not north. He did not know what he would find. He did not know what he would say. He only knew that he had to go. He had to set the first stone in the long, arduous path to atonement. He owed her the truth, even if she threw it back in his face. The sea air hit them the moment they stepped out of the hired carriage in Saltwind. It was a bracing, clean smell, a world away from the coal-choked air of London. The town was a jumble of whitewashed cottages, its streets narrow and cobbled. Fishing boats bobbed in the harbour, their masts a forest against the grey sky. It was raw, real, and alive. Alistair had taken rooms at the only inn, the Anchor. He left the girls with their governess, a new kind woman hired after he had dismissed Beatrice's creature and went in search of a ghost. He did not use her name. He simply started asking questions, showing a small, discreetly drawn sketch he had commissioned from memory. He asked about a woman with quiet grey eyes, a gentle manner, and a spine of steel. He spoke to the baker, who praised Anna's head for figures. He spoke to the fisherman, who spoke of her quick hands with a needle. He spoke to the vicar, who commended her quiet piety and her contributions to the church poor box. In London, Eleanor Ainsworth had been invisible. In Saltwind, Anna Gable was a pillar of the small community. He finally found her on the shingle beach at low tide. She was with a group of women and children, gathering winkles from the rock pools. She wore a plain apron over her dress, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, her hair escaping its pins in salty wisps. She was laughing, a sound he had never heard from her before. It was not the tinkling, artificial laugh of the ballroom, but a full, rich sound of genuine amusement, prompted by a little boy who had slipped and sat down in a pool of water. She looked up and saw him. He was standing at the edge of the beach, a dark, formal figure in this world of weathered wool and sea-bleached cotton. Her laughter died in her throat. The joy on her face vanished, replaced by a shuttered, wary stillness. The women around her fell silent, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. He walked towards her, his expensive leather boots crunching on the wet stones. Every step felt like a mile. He had rehearsed 100 speeches in his head, but now, faced with her, they all turned to ash in his mouth. He saw her hands, red and chapped from the salt water. He saw the new lines of strength and weariness around her eyes. He saw a woman who had been forged in a crucible of his making and had emerged stronger, harder, and utterly out of his reach. "Eleanor," he said, his voice hoarse. "My name is Anna," she replied, her voice cold and level. She did not rise. She remained kneeling on the stones, a small, impassable fortress. "You are mistaken, sir, and you are a long way from London." "Please," he said, the word a raw plea. "We need to talk." "I have nothing to say to you, your grace," she said, putting a deliberate, wounding emphasis on his title. It was a barrier, a reminder of the chasm between them. "This is my home now. You are trespassing." Before he could respond, two small figures came hurtling down the beach from the direction of the inn. "Eleanor, Eleanor, we found you." It was Elspeth and Isolde. They ran past him as if he were not there and threw themselves at the woman on the beach. Isolde buried her face in her skirts, sobbing with relief. Elspeth, more reserved, simply clung to her hand, her own eyes shining with unshed tears. Eleanor's composure finally broke. Her arms went around the two girls, pulling them into a fierce, protective embrace. She looked up at Alistair over their heads, and for the first time, he saw not coldness, but a flash of pure, righteous anger. "How dare you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "How dare you bring them here? How dare you use them to get to me?" "I did not," he said, his own voice cracking. "They would not be left behind. They miss you. I have missed you." "You have missed a convenient, unpaid governess," she shot back, her words like stones. "You have missed a quiet target for your aunt's venom. You did not miss me. You erased me." "I was wrong," he said, the words feeling pitifully inadequate. I was a blind, arrogant fool. I was deceived. Beatrice. She engineered the whole thing, the letter, the cufflink. It was all a lie, a vicious, calculated lie to get you out of the house so she could have free rein. Eleanor looked at him, her grey eyes searching his face. He saw a flicker of something, not belief, but a crack in her certainty. Isolde's tearful confession had been a child's story. This was the man himself, admitting it, but the wound was too deep, the betrayal too absolute. You believed her, she said, the simple statement, a judgment more damning than any tirade. You did not ask, you did not doubt. You looked at me, and you saw a whore and a thief. Your lies may have changed your grace, but that truth has not. She stood up, pulling the girls with her. Take your children, and go back to your world. There is nothing for you here. She turned her back on him and started walking towards the town, a small, weeping child clinging to each hand. Alistair stood alone on the beach, the sound of the waves hissing on the pebbles, like a chorus of mocking whispers. He had come bearing the truth, expecting it to be a key. He had not understood that the lock had been rusted shut by a year of pain, and that the woman who held it no longer cared if it was ever opened. He did not leave. To retreat now would be the ultimate act of cowardice, a confirmation of everything she believed him to be. He sent his daughter's governess back to London with a message for his staff and an order for his solicitor to join him. Then he did something that sent ripples of astonishment through the small town of Saltwind. The Duke of Blackwood, one of the wealthiest men in England, rented a tiny two-room fisherman's cottage at the edge of the harbour, a place that smelled of salt, damp, and old wood smoke. He moved in with a single trunk and his 2 daughters. He chopped his own wood for the small, inefficient fireplace. He bought fish directly from the boats and learned to cook it, badly, over the open flame. He washed their clothes in a bucket and hung them out to dry in the salty wind, where they never quite lost their dampness. He was clumsy, inept, and utterly out of his element. And every single person in Saltwind saw it. Eleanor, now Anna again in her own mind, tried to ignore him. She kept to her routine, mending and bookkeeping, her face a mask of determined indifference. But he was impossible to ignore. She would see him walking on the beach with the girls, his tall frame bent as he listened to their chatter. She would see him in the market, awkwardly haggling for potatoes, his fine London coat looking absurdly out of place. She saw the exhaustion on his face, the frustration in his eyes, and the dogged, stubborn set of his jaw. He was not playing a game, he was serving a penance. The twins became his unwitting ambassadors. They would appear at Mrs. Gable's inn, their faces smudged with soot. Papa burned the porridge again, Isolde would announce to the entire taproom. Can we have some of your bread, Mrs. Gable? Elspeth would simply hand Eleanor a perfect, unbroken seashell, a silent offering of peace. Eleanor's heart was a battlefield. The Anna she had become, the strong, independent survivor, wanted him gone. She had built a life here, a fragile but real peace, and his presence threatened it. But the Eleanor who remembered the lonely man in the study, the Eleanor who had seen a flicker of kindness in his eyes, was being slowly, painfully resurrected. She saw the change in him. The arrogance was gone, stripped away by humility and the daily struggle of a life he had never imagined. A week later, Mr. Reed arrived. He was a spectre from another world, with his starched collar and his leather satchel full of damning truths. Alistair did not summon Eleanor. He went to her. He found her in the small churchyard, tending the graves. Miss Ainsworth, he said, foregoing the name she had adopted. Mr. Reed is here. He has brought proof, affidavits, bank statements, a signed confession from Captain Llewellyn. I do not ask you to believe me. I ask you to look at the evidence. She straightened up, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. Why? She asked, her voice quiet. What good does it do now? My name is ruined in London. My life there is over. Your proof changes nothing. It changes everything, he insisted, his voice raw with an intensity that startled her. It proves that you are the most honest, honorable woman I have ever known. It proves that I was the worst kind of fool. I am not doing this to win you back, Eleanor. I am doing this because the truth deserves to be known. You deserve to be vindicated. He left her then, returning to his cottage. That evening, as a storm rolled in off the sea, lashing the small town with wind and rain, there was a knock on his door. It was Eleanor. She was wrapped in a heavy shawl, her hair damp, her face pale in the lantern light. Show me, she said. For the next 2 hours, by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, they sat at his rough wooden table while Mr. Reed laid out the anatomy of Beatrice's betrayal, the forged letters, the ledgers showing the hidden thefts, the cold, businesslike confession of the man who had been paid to help ruin her. Eleanor listened in silence, her face unreadable. With each document, another piece of the ugly puzzle slotted into place. When it was over, there was only the sound of the wind and the rain and the crackle of the fire. Eleanor finally looked up, not at the papers, but at Alistair. "She hated me that much," she said, her voice filled with a quiet wonder. "She did not hate you," Alistair said gently. "She envied you. She saw the goodness in you, the kindness you showed my daughters, and she saw it as a threat to her position. It was never about you, Eleanor. It was about her own greed and insecurity." A single tear traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was the first tear she had shed for that life in over a year. A tear not of sadness, but of understanding. The storm outside intensified, and the storm inside Eleanor finally broke. The anger, the hurt, the year of disciplined survival, it all crumbled. She saw not the powerful Duke of Blackwood, but a man humbled by his mistakes, trying desperately to put the pieces of his life and hers back together. Before anyone could speak again, a frantic pounding came at the door. It was the baker, his face white with panic. "It's the sea wall," he shouted over the wind. "The tide is higher than anyone's seen it. It's threatening to breach the lower town." Without a second's hesitation, Alistair was on his feet. He grabbed his coat. "Reed, stay with the girls. Eleanor, you should stay here. It's safer." "No," she said, her voice firm. She was already wrapping her shawl tighter. "Mrs. Gable is down there. Her cellars will flood. I know where the sandbags are stored." They ran out into the storm together, two people from different worlds, united by a common, immediate purpose. The night was chaos. The wind howled like a banshee, and the sea roared, its waves crashing over the stone pier, sending spray high into the air. The lower town was already ankle-deep in water. Alistair, who had commanded men in drawing rooms with a flick of his wrist, now found himself taking orders from a grizzled fisherman. He worked alongside the baker and the blacksmith, his ducal muscles screaming in protest, hauling sandbags, boarding up windows, his hands raw and bleeding. He was no longer a duke. He was just a man, fighting the sea. He saw Eleanor organizing the women, directing them to a makeshift infirmary in the church hall, her voice calm and clear over the roar of the storm. She was a natural leader, a queen in this small, battered kingdom. He had tried to put her in a gilded cage, and all along her spirit had been as wild and untamable as the ocean they were now fighting. They worked through the night, a desperate, exhausted army. At dawn, the storm broke. The tide receded. The sea wall had held. The town was battered and bruised, but it had survived. Alistair found Eleanor near the harbor, her face grey with exhaustion, her dress soaked and torn. He came to her, not as a duke, but as a fellow survivor. He had a tin cup of hot, sweet tea from the church hall. He handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. It was a jolt of electricity, a spark of warmth in the cold morning air. "We did it," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "You did it," he corrected her. "They listened to you." "They listened to us," she said, and her gaze met his. The barriers were gone, washed away by the storm. In her eyes, he saw not forgiveness, it was too soon for that, but acceptance, and a reluctant, cautious hope. Alistair returned to London the following week, leaving his daughters in Eleanor's care at the inn. It was a profound act of trust. He walked back into Blackwood House not as a grieving widower, but as a wrathful god. He convened a small, powerful group of his peers in his study, and then he sent for his aunt. Beatrice swept in, her face a mask of concern. "Alistair, you are back. Was Scotland dreadful? I have had the most terrible time managing without you." "I was not in Scotland, Beatrice," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "I was in a small town called Saltwind. You may have heard of it. It's where you sent an innocent woman to starve." The color drained from her face. She saw the other men in the room. She saw Mr. Reed standing by the door, a folder of papers in his hand. She saw the expression on Alistair's face. The game was over. He did not shout. He did not raise his voice. He simply laid out her crimes one by one with the cold, dispassionate precision of a surgeon. The debts, the thefts, the conspiracy, the confession of Captain Llewellyn. By the time he was finished, she was a broken woman. Her social standing, the only thing she had ever truly valued, was utterly destroyed. "You will be out of my house within the hour," he concluded. "Your things will be sent to a modest boarding house. I have arranged a small yearly allowance for you, enough to keep you from the workhouse. It is more mercy than you showed your niece. Now get out of my sight." She stared at him, her face a ruin of hatred and despair. "You chose her," she hissed, "a penniless, plain nobody, over me." "I chose honesty," he said. "I chose decency. I chose the mother of my children's hearts. Now go." She was escorted from the house she had ruled like a petty tyrant, her social world collapsing around her like a house of cards. Alistair stood in the silent hall, the air already feeling cleaner, lighter. He had put the final stone in place. He had cleared Eleanor's name. Now he had to see if he could ever be worthy of earning back her heart. He returned to Saltwyn not in a grand carriage, but on the public mail coach. He walked to the inn, his heart pounding. He found Eleanor in the garden, showing Elspeth and Isolde how to press flowers in a book, his book of poetry. He did not have a grand speech, he had only the truth. "It is done," he said. "She is gone. Your name is cleared. I have instructed my solicitor to restore your inheritance, the one she stole from you." Eleanor looked up. The girls ran to him, hugging his legs. He knelt and embraced them, his gaze never leaving hers. "What now?" she asked. "Now," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I throw myself on your mercy. I am not the man I was. You and this town have changed me. I am a better father, a better man, because of you. I know I do not deserve you. I know I have no right to ask. But I am asking. Eleanor Ainsworth, would you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife? Not to be a duchess in a cage, but to be my partner, my friend, my duchess of the sea and the storms, my heart." He was the Duke of Blackwood, kneeling in the dirt of an innkeeper's garden, his voice breaking, his eyes full of a love that was as vast and as humbling as the ocean. Eleanor looked at him, at this new man forged in the fires of regret and atonement. She looked at the two girls, their faces shining with hope. She thought of the cold, silent halls of Blackwood House and the warm, chaotic life she had built here. She knew they could not stay here, but she also knew they could never go back to what they were. They would build something new, together. A slow smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated joy. "Too old, too plain, and too poor, my aunt once counted," she said softly. Alistair's face lit up with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "My daughters and I," he said, his voice trembling with relief and happiness, "have always known how to count differently." He rose, and she met him halfway. In the quiet garden of a Saltwind inn, surrounded by the scent of roses and the sound of children's laughter, the Duke and the survivor finally found their haven, not in a palace but in each other's arms.